Your Honor, calling People versus Ethan Crumbley, case number 2022-279-506 FC.
Thank you. Good afternoon, council. Appearances for the record.
Aaron McDonald for the people.
Thank you, Mark Keys on behalf of the people.
David Williams on behalf of the people.
Paulette Michelle Lawton on behalf of Ethan Crumbley.
Amy Happ on behalf of Ethan Crumbley.
H. McKelvey on behalf of Ethan Crumbley.
Thank you. You all may be seated, and good afternoon to council. With that being said, before we broke for lunch, the people had rested. With that being said, defense, do you have any witnesses?
We do. Yes, Your Honor, we do.
Thank you. You may call your first witness.
We call Dr. Kenneth Romanowski.
Thank you. Doctor, you're going to approach the witness stand. You're going to stand in the witness box. Face my clerk to be sworn, sir. Thank you.
Please raise your right hand. Under penalty of perjury, do you swear or affirm the statements you're about to make to this court will be the whole truth?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Sentencing.
You may be seated, sir. Thank you. Sir, if you could please state your full name for the record and spell your last name.
Yes, it's Kenneth Arthur Romanowski, Romanowski.
Thank you. With that being said, sir, if you could please keep your voice up for me, I would greatly appreciate it.
Very good.
Thank you. Defense, your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Romanowski, can you tell me a little bit about your formal education, please?
Yes, I have a bachelor's, a master's, and a doctorate degree from the University of Michigan.
All of them are from University of Michigan?
Yes, they are.
And what is your bachelor degree in?
Bachelor's was in social sciences and history.
Did you have a specific major?
That was the major.
Social science?
Yes.
What about your master's?
Master's was guidance and counseling,
And your PhD?
counseling and community agencies.
And pursuant to that and your employment, do you have any sort of state licensing?
Master social worker, but that needs to be renewed.
And are you a member of any professional associations? And if so, which ones?
Michigan Correction Organization and the American Corrections Association.
Can you tell us a little bit about your employment, please?
Yes, I started work in the corrections field as juvenile care worker in a juvenile facility in 1975. Did that for about a year. Then I worked in a group home for juveniles. This is for juveniles being released from the boys training school, and also for boys that were coming into the system from other avenues. But most of these were troubled youth coming into the facility who had been in some form of detention. In 1979, I began working with the Department of Corrections. I was hired in as an agent in charge at a halfway house for offenders being released from prison. They were actually released on prison status, and they were stayed there for roughly a year or two while they found employment and maintained their family ties, and then they were finally released on parole. And prior to that, after that, I went to work with the Genesee County Probation Office, where I was a probation officer. And I did that for a few years. And then I went back to the Correction Center as agent in charge, as a supervisor, and then later as a manager of both the halfway house and the parole office in Genesee County.
And what positions have you held as a deputy or a warden?
Yes, I began working as a deputy warden at the Hiawatha Correction Facility up in the Upper Peninsula. And I worked there for roughly 2 years, and I transferred over to the Kinross Correctional Facility. And this was from 93 through just about the year 2000, 2001. And after 8 years in the Upper Peninsula, I transferred back downstate, just a short period of time at Detroit, and then over to the Huron Men's Facility, which was in Ypsilanti. And since that time, I've worked at numerous different facilities throughout the state, probably 8 different correction facilities.
And in your positions as deputy warden or warden, have you been involved in the management of prisoners who are referred to as juvenile lifers?
Yes, I have.
And do you have any sort of teaching experience?
Yes, I did. I taught with Siena Heights College.
And what did you teach?
I taught corrections, introduction to corrections.
And did you also teach with the University of Detroit?
Yes, prior to that, I taught corrections also from the University of Detroit.
Now, have you ever testified in a courtroom before?
Yes,
And have you ever been qualified as a witness? Or, I'm
Yes.
sorry, an expert?
yes, I have.
And can you tell us where you've been qualified as an expert?
This would have been out of Kent County. Judge Trusak's court
And how many times have you been qualified as an expert?
twice. And the third time I was not necessary. Settlement which we reached.
And those 2 times were both in Kent County?
Yes,
And would those have been both times involving cases where the issue was whether to sentence someone as a juvenile to life in prison without parole?
actually, these were after the fact. These were offenders that actually been incarcerated for a lengthy period of time as juvenile lifers, and were looking at possible sentence reductions under the JWLOP.
Now, is there a certain theory or methodology you use for evaluating cases involving life without parole sentences?
Generally, I look at their entire record from the time they come into the system up to the time I'm doing the report. And I look at their misconduct history, what they've done since they were in prison. I look at what programs they're involved in, which of the core programs they completed for the Department of Corrections, what their education was, whether or not they completed their high school education while they're in prison. Looked at their employment. Did they maintain employment while they were in prison?
Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to qualify Dr. Romanowski as an expert in corrections.
No objection, Your Honor.
Thank you. This witness will be reflected as an expert in the area of corrections. You may proceed.
Now, Dr. Romanowski, this case is a little different, correct?
That is correct.
And could you describe how it's different?
Well, it's different in that the Miller hearing's being held before the person is sentenced, where the other ones I've worked with, and I've done reports, I have several that are pending, probably about a dozen have all been with the offender being having his Miller hearing after he was sentenced instead of prior.
And just kind of briefly, that's because Miller brought about a change in the law, correct?
Correct.
And so people that had been sentenced as juveniles to life without parole then had the opportunity to be released, correct?
Correct.
And in your work, are you familiar with the Miller factors?
Yes, for the most part.
In particular, you're familiar with the one involving rehabilitation, would that be true?
Yes, potential for rehabilitation and maturity or immaturity of the offender.
Have you reviewed any sort of documents regarding Ethan Crumbley?
Yes, I have.
And what types of documents have you reviewed?
For the most part, the documents I reviewed were his jail records.
And is it customary for you to consider those types of records in your role as a witness?
Generally, when I'm considering those records, it's in addition to the Department of Corrections records. But in this case, all I had were the records from Oakland County Jail.
And have you ever met or interviewed Ethan Crumbley?
No, I have not.
And you don't know information as to some of the factors, for example, his home life or family environment, correct?
Only from what I read in the news.
Thank you. Now, did you prepare a report in this matter?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, it's exhibit number J for the record. And do you have a copy of that report with you?
Yes, I did.
Now, Ethan is a juvenile placed in the county jail here in Oakland County, correct?
Correct.
What does that mean for him?
Well, what that means for him is obviously he's being considered as an adult for sentencing. That is part of it, but it's also the fact that or the charges, I'm sorry, but it's also due to the fact that he is a juvenile in an adult facility, so he has to be maintained under strict observation at all times. He has to be kept from any person over the age of 18. And part of this is the PREA, Prison Rape Elimination Act requirements.
And we've heard, with respect to Ethan, the phrase out of sight and sound. Can you explain what that means?
What that basically means is that you have to remain out of sight and sound of an adult offender. And if you are not, you have to be in direct supervision with a custody staff member.
Now, are you familiar with the Oakland County Jail, the physical structure?
No, I am not.
Okay. To your knowledge, do the county jails have cell blocks designated for juveniles that are placed there?
There may be some jails that do, but I'm not familiar if they are. I do know in this case here, he was placed in the clinic area.
Now, are you familiar with the term suicide watch?
Yes, I am.
And in reviewing the records regarding Ethan, has Ethan ever been on suicide watch?
Yes, several times while I was in the Oakland County Jail.
And what does suicide watch consist of?
It's basically direct observation. They're recorded every 15 minutes, but I believe they also put them on the camera, so he's constantly under view of the staff member.
And is that a little bit different from something called active behavior watch?
Yes, it is, but the two, in terms of the amount of frequency of checks, are the same. They're every 15 minutes.
Is Ethan subject to active behavior watch?
He has been most of his time. He's been in the jail. Matter of fact, all the time, if it wasn't suicide.
And that means somebody's checking on him, you said every 15 minutes?
That is correct.
And they do something to notate what they've checked or what they've observed?
Yes, that's on the active suicide watch sheet. And these are recorded every 15 minutes, plus whether or not he was standing, sitting, laying, whatever.
Do you know what commissary is?
Yes,
What is that?
commissary is basically where you can order up items for yourself if you have the funds to pay for them, such as snacks. And I think in Ethan's case, he ordered quite a few snacks out of the commissary, and that's why he wasn't eating his meals.
And that also involves hygiene items, correct?
Yes, it does. He buys soap, shampoo, deodorant.
Clothing such as socks and t-shirts.
I believe so.
Now, are you familiar with the term privilege as it's used in the jail or prison environment?
Yes, privileges in the jail and prison are going to be a little bit different, but I believe in his case, he was under administrative segregation type setting, meaning he was not released from his cell. So his privileges would have been basically his visits, his phone time, maybe his use of the tablet, which all the offenders have provided use of the tablet, and possibly his movies and his television.
Now, you just mentioned administrative segregation. Does Ethan get to go outside? Does he have that opportunity?
I'm not sure if the jail has an outside pen or not, but if so, would be under a caged area.
Does he get a recreation time if it's perhaps inside instead
Yes, I
outside?
believe he does. Yes.
And do you know about how many times a week or how long?
I believe it's 1 hour per day.
And did you see any records where Ethan takes advantage or doesn't take advantage of that
For
opportunity?
the most part, he did not take advantage of that.
Now, those records you reviewed, do those also reflect that he was diagnosed with a mental illness?
I saw in the records where he was being seen by a psychiatrist, but I did not have any mental health records to review.
Okay. The records you reviewed, did they show that he was compliant with taking his medication?
Not always, but it looked like for the most part he was.
And more frequently than not, he took it?
I am guessing, again, this is based upon the suicide watch sheets. They'll note that. Also, the observation sheets will note that too. There's a box they check if the meds are taken. In some cases, it was left blank, so either I assumed he was no longer on meds or they just didn't record it. But I would say about half and half.
Now, it doesn't say what the medication is or what it's for, though, correct?
Or it's not.
Now you mentioned you noticed from the records he was participating in some sort of counseling.
Yes, he was in counseling with a therapist. He was seeing a therapist. Now, what kind of counseling he was in, I couldn't tell you.
Did that increase or decrease in frequency?
I believe he was seeing the psychiatrist once a week.
And he's consistently participated with that therapist, correct?
Yes, I don't think he's refused to see the psychiatrist.
Now, you mentioned he'd been on suicide watch several times. Is that a result of some sort of report that's been made about him experiencing suicidal thoughts?
Yes, those reports are found in the IMAX system. I'm not sure what IMAX stands for, but it's generally the find reports from the jail. The find reports are the incident reports that occur. And these are a little bit more detailed in terms of his behavior while he's in the jail. And there were several occasions where he had either done something towards self-harm, such as hitting his head into the wall or ramming his head into the door, or possible suicide behavior. There's one occasion where he was on his bunk with his shirt tied around the speaker and then his shirt tied to that, and it was believed he was trying to hang himself. But it says also that he said he was just trying to muffle the noise, and there was in fact a report that maybe a week prior he was trying to muffle the noise.
Now, you mentioned IMAX. Is that something you had access to as well?
Yes, I had those were the find results generally.
And in those records, did you see that he had been reporting hearing voices and being paranoid?
Yes, I did.
And what about any sort of indication of delusional behavior or paranoia before the incident?
Prior to the murders, he was in fact hearing voices, I believe, at his home. His parents had reported that he had some delusional behavior and he had some fear about staying in the home because of persons coming out of different rooms.
Now, you've mentioned misconduct. Between November and December of 2021, were there any instances of misconduct that you found in the records?
No, there were not.
How about any misconduct in the entire year of 2022?
No, none that I noticed.
Did you notice any sort of misconduct in the year 2023?
Yes, I did. That's all the misconduct that I found was in those years.
And what types of misconduct was that?
The misconducts, by the way, all occurred within about a 3-month period from February through May of 23. And for the most part, the misconducts were what we call minor rule violations in Department of Corrections, but should be noted, the Oakland County Jail does refer to them as formal misconducts. These misconducts would include items, such things as making items out of toilet paper, which were dice, and then making a checkerboard to roll the dice, or a game board to roll the dice on. Another occasion, he in fact had his window that the deputies look into his cell blocked with cardboard boxes and also trash bags. They were taken down, but he put them back up. So they just took him out of the room. There was another incident in which his password was given to another inmate so that inmate could make phone calls to his relatives. He'd obviously either used his or didn't have the credits for the phone calls.
Okay, so let me stop you there for a minute. As it relates to phone usage, you have to have some sort of credits. Does that cost money?
I believe it does in the county jail.
And you are assigned some sort of a number or password that you then put in the phone as you're making an outgoing call.
That is correct.
Obviously, you don't receive incoming calls, correct?
No, you do not receive incoming calls unless it's maybe from your attorney.
Now, have there been any instances where his cell wasn't as clean as the deputies thought it should be?
Probably most incidents.
Okay. And you mentioned that here in the county jail, they have a different significance than they do in the Department of Corrections, correct?
Yes, they're at a different level. These probably would correlate to a major misconduct in the county jail, whereas within the Department of Corrections, they would be minor misconducts or even violation of posted rules, which would be like a summary ticket.
Kind of like a speeding ticket instead
Yes.
of a misdemeanor.
Yes, he did receive 3 misconducts for not having them.
Now, when he's received misconducts, what sort of punishment has there been?
Loss of privileges.
And those would be the ability to use the tablet, watch TV, things like that.
Exactly.
And would loss of privileges also be the type of discipline he would be subject to in the Department of Corrections?
It would be very similar, except for he would probably have more privileges he could end up losing because he would have time out of his cell. There may be different activities or programs he could be attending and he may not be able to attend depending upon whether or not it was recreational or personal program or whether or not it was department required program.
Now, when somebody gets transferred from the jail to the Department of Corrections and they're a juvenile, do you expect to see, or has your experience been to see a number of misconducts?
Yes, most offenders, when they come into the system, the Department of Corrections, especially the juveniles, will pick up a good series of tickets their first several years. In fact, may even be, depending upon what year they come in. But they will pick up tickets all the way till they're about 26, and then it's like somebody flips the switch. Those greatly decline at that point.
And based on your experience and your knowledge, is there a reason those individuals may have more tickets at the outset?
I believe in part is because they are coming in as immature individuals and they are learning to become adults and understand the responsibility and the consequences of those misconducts. Also, I think in many cases, the individuals are coming in as rebellious about being in prison. They're just realizing that they are now going to serve a long term. And when this hits home, they act out negatively. And in some cases, they'll do this too to show that try to show that they're a tough guy so that people don't mess with them by either being insolent towards staff or possibly even fighting with other inmates.
And I refer to a ticket. When you get a misconduct, the way you're notified of any sort of discipline is through something called a ticket. Would that be correct?
Yes, ticket, misconduct, basically the same thing.
And I guess the easiest way to talk about what you were just saying is some people have kind of a bravado in getting tickets so they don't become prey in the system, correct?
That could be another reason too, yes. So they're not preyed upon. So they're, again, showing they're not to be messed with.
And in the review of the records you completed, were you able to tell whether Ethan has been participating in any sort of education programming?
Yes, I believe he was working on his high school education, his GED. He was working on it through the tablet. And I believe he paid for this himself, at least that's what the jail records show, that there was money that was put into his account and that money was used to pay for the GED tablet. And there were 4 different courses he was taking toward taking his TABE, his test for adult basic education prior to taking the GED.
And do you know how far he was able to go in that program?
Official records, no, but from what I understand is that he was able to get up to the point of taking the TABE, the tape, but it needs to be proctored as well as the GED need to be proctored, and the jail was not able to accommodate the proctor.
Is that something the Department of Corrections can accommodate?
Oh, yes.
And is the GED programming, if you were to need to do review courses or something like that, available for juvenile lifers in the prison system?
Yes, that program is available for juvenile lifers. Certainly that's one of the major tasks that he'll be facing when he comes in, is completing that GED. That'll be part of his RNGC requirements.
Once Ethan is sentenced, what's the next step for him? Where does he go?
Once he's sentenced by this court, he will go immediately to the Thumb Correctional Facility, and that will be his intake process. Normally, offenders over 18 and over would go to RGC in Jackson, but in this case here, the RGC is at the Thumb for the youthful offenders.
So because of his age, he's treated slightly different than the normal prisoner, but the same as other prisoners of his age, correct?
Yeah, I would say it's a slight difference. I mean, they do have them separate totally from any adults, except for classes where they have an officer with them.
So that's absence or apart from sight and sound carries forward into the Department of Corrections
Definitely, definitely. Now-
until what age?
That would go up into age 18.
And at age 18, what changes?
Well, in his case, seeing how he's going to Lapeer to the thumb, he may transfer over to the HIDA, the Homes Youthful Training Act section, which also has youth in it, but it's normally not youth that are under the same circumstances as the juvenile lifers or juvenile commissions of serious crimes. These are generally less serious crimes, but they have a separate section for them. But once he's 18, he may be housed with them. And that could be all the way up to age 27 in that particular program.
And once he's aged 18, he can be housed with other adults. Is that true?
Yes, and technically he would be transferred to another adult facility.
But until he's 26, there's a tendency to keep them in facilities with people the same age. Is that correct?
Depending upon the behavior of the individual, their particular needs for programming, but normally not given a priority unless they come in as youth.
Now, I think you mentioned in your report, he would be classified. Can you explain what that is?
Classified, I probably was referring to security classification. And this is the level of security that he'd be maintained for the safety, security, prevention of escape, etc., in the Department of Corrections. And there are, in fact, 5 different levels of classification: secure 1, level 1, which is non-secure level 1, which is similar to the old camp program, but we don't have camps. We still have non-secure facilities. Level 2 would be medium security. Level 3 is no longer used. And level 4 would be what they call close. That's 1 step away from the maximum security. Level 5 would be maximum security.
In each of those different security levels, obviously, have their own level of security at the facility, correct?
Yes, each facility has its own level of security. Some facilities are strictly for maximum security cases, and some are just for level 1 non-secure cases. In the case of the thumb, that is a level 2 facility or medium security facility.
Now, are you familiar with the term rehabilitation?
Yes,
And what does that mean?
well, I know it's been bantered around a bit as there is no such thing as rehabilitation. It starts with habilitation, but essentially it means offenders are changing by their involvement in programs, that their behavior is changing, and that they're becoming a better person.
Are there certain types of programs that you look at in rehabilitation, such as education, employment skills, things like that?
All those factors, plus therapy and treatment would also be included.
Is there programming for someone in Ethan's position within the Michigan Department of Corrections?
Yes, certainly.
Is there mandatory programming versus voluntary programming?
As a youth, he's going to be pretty much into a lot of mandatory programming. And we're coming in as a juvenile lifer. If he came in as a juvenile lifer, anyway, he comes in as a juvenile, he'll be subject to mandatory therapy. He'll have to go to at least every other week attending mental health treatment.
Any other type of programming?
There are also other programming offered. Yes, he'll have the education programming. He'll either go back to ABE and work on completing his high school diploma or working on the GED. And that's something they'll work out with the principal. He'll be involved in different types of treatment programs. And I'm not talking about therapy here, but treatment programs could include, and will likely include, the assaultive offender program. This is a program that sometimes is difficult for people serving lengthy sentences to get into. He will also be involved in the violence protection or prevention program, or the VPP, violence prevention. He'll be involved in substance abuse if there's some indication he has a substance abuse history, which I don't recall seeing based upon the records I had. he will be reviewed for mental health treatment. Mental health treatment will, again, you will automatically be involved in mental health treatment, whether he agrees to it or not. That will be part of his treatment. But he will also be assessed to see if he needs further or more in-depth mental health treatment. So he will receive a full psychological and psychiatric evaluation.
And if that indicates a greater need than every other week, would that service be provided in the Department of Corrections?
Yes, it would.
And would he be participating in any sort of like anger management or cognitive
Yes.
behavior programming?
Yes, there is anger management, and that is actually a program. They have a couple of different versions of it, but certainly that's something he would be referred to. Cognitive behavioral programs through they are their CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, where he's able to examine his behavior and his thoughts, what got him into that behavior to begin with. So yes, these would be programs. Impulse control would be another one he may qualify for. This would all be based upon the referral from the psychiatrist.
Now, are there sorts of voluntary programs he can participate in?
Yes.
And what types of programs would those be?
Well, there are community-based programs that come in, which include religious services, which many offenders do participate in. And the religious services usually have a wide variety of programs they're offering in addition to just a weekly religious service. They'll have weekly meetings or even additional Bible study meetings or Quran, whatever it may be, that will go on from that point. There are groups such as Chance for Life. Chance for Life is a group that works with offenders serving long sentences, especially the younger offenders. And they are mentored by older offenders that have been in the program. And the intent there is to help the person become acclimated to prison and to understand what they need to do while they're in the system. And this program has been very successful. A lot of the youth that have been paroled by the Department of Corrections under the Miller have been involved in the Chance for Life.
As mentors or as participants?
Well, they had been participants, but by the time they were paroled, I'm sure they were mentors.
Now, what sorts of educational opportunities beyond high school are there in the Department of Corrections?
Well, until recently, that was basically it. And that was because of the law that indicated that offenders could not no longer qualify for Pell Grants. But there are other grants. Generally, these are private grants that have been made available to the offenders so that they can continue their education in college.
So he has the opportunity to attend college classes in the Department of Corrections?
He will.
And we were speaking about mental health, the treatment. Is there medication involved if his mental health diagnosis requires some sort of medication?
Yes, it'll probably be psychotropic medication.
And is that medication supervised?
Yes, it's the medication's given out at the med line. The med line has an officer that watches the offender. The nurse also watches the offender as the medication is handed to him. He has to put it in his mouth, drink it with the water, and then do a tongue check to make sure it was swallowed.
What about employment opportunities? Are there any employment opportunities for someone in his position?
When he first gets in, he's going to be limited to employment in the youth housing. And that will probably be as a porter, assistance in serving food, or groundskeeper, maintenance type positions, cleaning positions, all right in the housing, youth housing.
And that would be because of his age being under 18?
Yes, that is good.
And are those same opportunities available once he turns 18?
Well, if he stays in the youth section, again, with the HIDA, he probably will have that same kind of employment. If he's put into the GP, which he would qualify for, the general population, then he'd have more different possibilities for jobs. His jobs could include working as a clerk in the library. It could be working as a student assistant. It could be working on the grounds, much bigger grounds, obviously, in the general population. Could be working with the maintenance department. Could be working in the laundry, the commissary. So there are many different places he could work.
Now, are there any sort of risk assessment tools used in the Michigan Department of Corrections?
Yes, there are several different risk assessments.
And could you describe those?
We already went through one of them, which is his classification, security classification. But in addition, there is the kind of almost out of practice use, but the risk assessment and the property assessment tools, which are just basically looking at his offense, his age of first offense, and any serious misconduct he may have picked up in the institution. And then there's the property offense, which looks at those same factors, but these two factors generally do not coincide with one another. They may. He just my personal review of the file for what I have known about his background in the offense, he would probably go in as what they call a medium assault risk. And if you were to pick up serious institutional misconduct, he'd be made a high assault risk.
And are those risk assessment tools used continuously?
They are, but not as much as they used to be. Matter of fact, even on the security classification screen, they still have a spot for the high of the property risk. Risk assessment.
So is it a tool that's used to place somebody within a facility within the Department of Corrections?
When you're being placed at any facility prior to transfer, or even within the facility itself, there's always rescreening under the security risk classification, at least annually or upon transfer. Or if there's a change, if he were to pick up several serious misconducts, that could change his security risk classification also.
Now, you've mentioned you've participated before in reviews of sentences of people who were previously sentenced of life without parole. In those cases, have some of them been resentenced to life without parole?
Yes, they have.
And in some of those cases, have they been sentenced to a term of years?
Yes, they have. And that's
Yeah.
the two were both terms of years.
And based on your experiences as a warden, deputy warden, and in of being a witness, have you done any research about the recidivism rates for people released after initially being sentenced to life without parole?
Yes, Montclair College did a study on juvenile lifers that were released. And this was done in Pennsylvania. There are 3 states that have the highest amount of juvenile lifer offenders, and that's Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Louisiana. So they did a study looking at the rate of recidivism, and they found that only 4% of the offenders released under the Miller decision were rearrested. Out of that 4%, only 2% had committed a new offense. In Michigan, there are no statistics run per se, but the department does keep record. And up to this point, there's roughly close to 200 different offenders that have been released that were juvenile offenders that have been released onto parole. And out of those 200 offenders, during the time since the Miller decisions come down, only 1 has been charged with a new crime, which is less than 1%.
Now, could you explain if Ethan were to get a term of years, the minimum is supposed to be between 25 and 40 under the law? What does that mean?
Well, 25 is the minimum sentence and 40 would be the max. If that were the way it's done. Now, if we're talking about strictly a minimum, then 25, anywhere from 25 to 40 would be the minimum term. So I'm not sure in what reference this is being used.
And the maximum penalty under the statute is 60 years, correct?
All right.
So the 25 to 40 would be the minimum on the minimum end of a sentence. And the 60 would be the maximum, correct?
Yes.
So in a case like this, the judge has the opportunity to sentence somebody to, say, for example, 40 to 60 years, correct?
Correct.
Or 30 to 60 years,
Yes.
or 25 to 60 years.
Yes. All those are possibilities.
But the absolute minimum would be the 25, correct?
If that's the range, it's there. Yes.
Now, are you familiar with how felony firearm charges are treated?
Generally, felony firearms have a flat 2-year term.
And that would be in addition to whatever other sentence was imposed for other offenses?
I believe it would be a consecutive sentence, but I'm not positive.
So consecutive, you would mean like 2 plus something, correct? Now, as you're calculating time in the Michigan Department of Corrections, is the minimum sentence what we refer to as calendar days?
Basically, the minimum term an offender receives is gonna be what you see is what you get. If he got a 25-year term or a 40-year term minimum, he's going to serve 40 years on that minimum. There's no longer any good time. The department did away with that back in 1987, and they converted to disciplinary credits, which the parole board had the authority to grant basically good time. And they did away with that about 15 years after that. So there is no reduction in the sentence. The only reduction would be that of the jail credits that he would receive.
And that means jail credits, that he's getting credit on a future sentence for time he's serving now in jail, correct?
It would be, yes, in this case, this would be that future sentence.
So if he's been in jail 1 year, he would get 1 year credit, correct?
Correct.
And that would go, if you know, if you're not, let me know, to the felony firearm counts, correct?
That I do not know.
Okay. Now, if he were to be sentenced to, for example, 30 years to 60 years, when he hits the 30-year mark, what happens?
Well, really, it doesn't mean he gets out, walks out the door. That just means he served the minimum amount he needs to serve in prison. So the parole board would then get what they call the PBJ, the parole board jurisdiction. They would review his case and determine whether or not they wanted to, in fact, consider him for parole.
And how many people make up the parole board? Do you know?
Usually it's 10 members together. A majority has to be in favor of any decision, major decision.
And what sorts of things does the parole board look at in determining whether to grant parole?
First and foremost is danger to the community if released, danger and risk to the public.
Is there, I guess, sort of a scoring sheet where they figured that risk out?
There is, can I say if I've seen one or know exactly what's in it? No, I can't. But yes, they do use a scoring sheet and they do look at other factors. When I say risk, they're going to also look at his involvement in prison programs, his misconducts, the crime. All these factors are looked at.
Would it be fair to say that someone who doesn't behave themselves or participate in programs is less likely to get out at their minimum sentence?
Yes, that is very correct.
Now, are you familiar with the term flop?
Yes.
And what does that mean?
Flop means that a person was not given a parole and they'll be considered at some other date. Essentially, they are in the days when we had good time, it had a different connotation, but it's still the same thing. It means they're going to do additional time. The board may review it in another 5 years, but it's actually at the board's discretion whether or not they actually want to interview them at that time.
And before they're paroled, they have to go through the interview process as well as this review of what they've been doing while they've been in the Department of Corrections, correct?
Right. A parole eligibility report is prepared, and that looks at his entire adjustment while he's been in prison, including the misconducts. And just as a note on the misconducts, even though you can't take away from that minimum, you can add to that minimum if you get a major misconduct. So any major misconduct, and it's usually on a scale as how many days will be added on to his sentence. But if he gets enough major misconducts, conceivably, he could be up to his minimum term, although that's, I think, pretty rare to see.
Now, if he were to be sentenced to a term of years, the maximum being 60, could he be kept until the 60-year mark?
Certainly.
So he doesn't have to be granted parole, correct?
And there are a number of offenders that never do see that parole.
And is it the parole board that decides how long they're going to flop a person for?
Well, they will decide when they will review the person again, yes.
Now, I think we talked about this before. He will be kept at the Thumb Correctional Facility until he's at least 18, correct?
Correct.
Then it would be up to the Department of Corrections to determine whether he stays there until he's about 26, 27.
Well, that would just be in the HYTA program that he would be able to stay in that unit. He would not be actually a participant in HYTA, he would just be in with those offenders.
And it's up to the Department of Corrections then where and what facility he gets moved to and how frequently, correct?
That is correct. Usually the classification committee at the institution would make a recommendation. And generally they go along with that.
Now, one of the goals of the Department of Correction is habilitation or rehabilitation, correct?
Yes, definitely. That is why it's called corrections.
And based on the information you've reviewed as it relates to Mr. Crumbley, have you formed an opinion about his potential to be rehabilitated?
I have, but keep in mind, I've had very limited information, basically with his records in jail. But honestly, I think everybody has that potential to change. And I think Mr. Crumbley would be no exception to that rule. But I think he has to make that choice. He has to be the one to say, I'm willing to change.
And he would go about doing that by participating in those programs, the employment, the education possibilities that are available to him, correct?
Correct.
And if he were to decide he didn't want to participate or be rehabilitated, he would be treated by the Department of Corrections accordingly, right?
Person that probably sits by idly, not involved in anything, is not going to get a very positive evaluation.
Now, if Ethan were sentenced to life without parole, how would the programming be different for him than if he were sentenced to a number of years?
The programming wouldn't change either way.
Would he still qualify for all of the programs, Thumb or any other facility he has available?
He would, all dependent upon the level of security. Now, the Thumb only has level 2. Now, he would probably stay waved down. That means he's moved down to a level 2 to remain at the Thumb. But if he were to go to another facility, they might consider he would likely be a level 4, at least until he has that first 5 years in with the department before he could be reduced down to a level 2. So he wouldn't automatically qualify to go to any institution that has programs that he's interested in or that they think he should have. That security level is going to be the overriding factor. But in most cases, the programs are pretty universal throughout the department, although some institutions only offer certain programs, such as the Thumb has building trades, construction trades, etc.
And do these programs tend to have a list of people wanting to participate in them?
They generally do, yes.
And what sort of priority would somebody on a life without parole have on those lists?
Somebody doing life without parole would be able to get into building trades. Where it's going to be more difficult is to get into some of the required programming offered by the PSUs, such as assault offender programming. That he's going to be put on the back of the list because there are other offenders that are waiting to get out of prison that are close to their parole eligibility date. And those offenders are going to get priority. And it's understandable why the department does that. They want to make sure these programs are going to be released. The prisoners released do have that programming in advance.
When you use the term PSU, what do you mean by that?
Psych services.
Thank you.
And would his priority, would he keep getting bumped by people who come into the facility that may have a release date?
Oh, yes. Yeah, if they have an ERD coming up before his, and again, depending upon his sentence, it's hard to say what that would be. But if theirs is prior to his, he's going to get bumped. And if he indicated if he's doing life without parole, he will likely not see that for a long time, if at all.
And ERD, which you just referred to, is earliest release date?
That is correct.
I have no further questions, Your Honor. Thank you.
Thank you. People Cross.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Romanowski.
Good afternoon.
Dr. Romanowski, I think this came out late in your testimony. You believe in rehabilitation, right?
Yes, I do.
And you really believe in it for everybody.
I believe that everybody has that potential.
Okay. Have you ever met an inmate or a defendant who, after 2 years of incarceration or a little less, like this defendant, that you would say could never be rehabilitated?
No, I've got them to have it.
Okay. In other words, for anyone in this defendant's position, you would offer the same testimony you offered today about the programs that are available and about the possibility of someone participating in those programs and getting rehabilitated.
Yes,
Dr. Romanowski, you mentioned previous cases you worked on are Miller cases where someone has already been sentenced. In many cases, they had lengthy prison terms already under their belt, right?
yeah, yes, they had served lengthy periods of
They
time.
might have 30 or 40 years.
There are some cases where they have had up to that amount of time. Some had less, some had 15, some had 20, some had 25.
And you'll see some who are past that age of 26 when you say
Most of them are past it.
okay. And so you don't have that in this case.
No, we don't.
Okay. So you can't say where this defendant's going to be in 20 years.
No, and it's where this is a bit different from the other Miller hearings that have come down.
Would you agree with me that some defendants are more likely to be rehabilitated than others?
I believe that some are going to be a lot harder to rehabilitate.
Doctor, you mentioned on page 5 of your report that you reviewed some emails retrieved from the defendant's parents. What are you referring to?
Well, I don't think I saw the emails referred from his parents. And actually, the emails that I found in his file were from his grandparents and his aunt.
Okay, thank you, doctor. So those are jail messages, not things related to prior to the crime.
Correct.
Okay, one of the things you did mention is the importance of maintaining family ties, correct?
Importance of family ties?
Yes.
Yes, as long as it's a positive family tie.
Okay, so that's important in rehabilitation. You agree?
I agree that if you have a good family, or if you've got a supportive family and it's going to be benefit to you to maintain those ties, you should. But if, on the other hand, if the family has not been a good family, I did not think that would be a good recommendation.
So, doctor, are you familiar with this defendant's parents' actions after his arrest?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and are you familiar with the text message his mother sent to a friend? And I'm going to read it to you and you can tell me if you're aware of this. The best lawyer in the world isn't going to get the defendant out of prison. So right now we're taking care of ourselves.
Yes, I believe I read that, and where I read it, that was actually in the news.
Okay. And are you aware that his parents drained his bank account?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Okay. And so when you talked about the defendant paying for his GED, you're not indicating that he came up with that money. In fact, he came in with $0 because his parents had taken all his money.
Right, I believe his relatives put the money in his
Okay.
other relatives other than his parents.
Doctor, did you watch the hearing yesterday?
No, I did not.
Okay. And did you watch the hearing this morning?
Only news clips.
Okay. So you didn't hear the victims who were in the school testify.
No, I didn't, but I know it's horrific.
You've never seen the video of the school shooting.
No, I have not.
You're not familiar with this defendant's history of obsession with extreme violence, about spending a lot of times on websites they aggregate videos of people being beheaded and cats being boiled alive.
No, I'm not aware. I did hear that on the news.
You've not reviewed the video of this defendant torturing a baby bird.
No.
Or about his writings about that and how he enjoyed that.
No.
About his desire to kill and torture, particularly to kill and torture younger victims, not just baby birds, but as he said, little kids.
I have heard about it, but I did not see the video or anything that was there.
Are you aware of the way each of the victims in this case was killed?
I know they were shot. No, I don't think it was execution style. I'm assuming this was random.
So, Dr. Romanowski, that's really important. I'm glad you said that. Are you aware the defendant took a gun and strode up to a girl sitting against a locker who had her head covered, put the gun right to her head and executed her? Were you aware of that?
No, I was not.
Do you know what happened to Justin Schilling in the bathroom? The last victim who was killed?
I do not, but I believe there was testimony given regarding one of the other juveniles that was in the bathroom.
You heard that testimony.
Just bits of it
That
coming
he,
out. I
that he
didn't have a
ordered him
lot
onto
of
the
space.
ground and he put the gun to the back of his head and he shot him. He executed him. You were not aware of that before today.
No, I wasn't.
You said there's programming available. That's generally, right? That's not specific to this defendant.
There is no programming that is designed to be specific to any one defendant.
I just want to ask you about a couple of those programs. You're not aware that this defendant needs substance abuse treatment.
No, I was not.
Okay. You mentioned a program that helps with patients. You're not aware that this defendant needs help with patients.
Now, when you say patients, do you mean patients such as a hospital patient or patients as a being patient?
As in being patient.
Yes, there are programs for that.
Okay. And are you aware that this defendant doesn't need that? He's got plenty of patients.
I don't know if I am aware he has plenty of patients.
Okay. Are you aware whether he has a problem with impulse control?
I would assume he does have a problem with impulse control.
Okay. You're assuming that.
Yes,
Again, without reference to all of his writing leading up to the crime, of all of his planning, of his getting the gun, and the way in which he killed the victims. So you're saying you think maybe he has a problem with impulse control without knowing the fact.
I'm saying that I would still think he has a problem with impulse control based upon his behavior in the jail.
You referenced, doctor, that right now there's no good time for defendants. You mentioned that?
Right, correct. Unless you were put into the system prior to 1987.
Okay. And are you aware that, in fact, right now, there are bills pending in the Michigan legislature to restore good time credit? You aware of that?
No, I'm not.
Okay. You know, prosecutors generally oppose that, but that's what's being considered right now. So this defendant could be sentenced. These victims could hear his sentence, and next year he could start getting good time credit.
I would think that the law would not be retroactive.
But you would think that, doctor,
I would think
but
that.
you'd want to read that bill. In your 44 years of corrections, you said you held ultimate responsibility for the supervision of tens of thousands of prisoners, probationers, and parolees. Is that right?
That's correct.
You've pretty much seen it all.
Well, I won't say I've ever seen it all because they've not seen it all.
Of those tens of thousands of people, how many had carried out a mass shooting? And by a mass shooting, I mean a defendant who had killed more than 4 people.
Well, I've had some that were 3 people. I had one that was a family of 5. So there have been a few, but they're far and few and in between, thankfully.
And were any of those terrorists?
No, I don't think any of those were charged with terrorism.
And have you ever advocated for the release of a mass shooter from prison?
4 and more, no.
Okay. And of the juvenile lifers released that you mentioned in Michigan, you talked about the recidivism rate being maybe less than 1%. Were any of those mass shooters?
To my knowledge, they were not, but again, I'm not aware of all the different crimes that were committed. Now, there was one that did receive a reduced sentence, but again, not 4. We're at 3.
Thank you, Doc. I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you. Defense redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Romanowski, your expertise in your testimony here today as an expert is based on what happens when an inmate walks through the door of the Department of Corrections, correct?
Correct.
And in this case, you've taken into account the records that you've been provided from the Oakland County Jail, correct?
Correct.
Now, you're not focused when you're reviewing or when you're working as a warden necessarily with how a person got to your facility, correct?
No, I'm not.
Now, you mentioned that some people could be harder to rehabilitate, correct?
That's correct.
But even the hardest person, it's not impossible to rehabilitate them, correct?
I believe that is the case.
Has there been anybody you've come in contact with where it's been impossible to rehabilitate them?
No, but I can't say there's been any magic touch where every person I've seen has been rehabilitated. That's not the case.
So there are people based on your experience that haven't been rehabilitated, correct?
That is correct.
Even though they have the potential, correct?
Yes.
And you've been exposed to inmates that have committed horrific offenses, correct?
Correct.
And even the most horrific of offenses you still believe that there's the opportunity for rehabilitation, correct?
Yes, I do.
And that's the focus, correct? The opportunity for rehabilitation.
Correct. But again, the individual has to make the choice to take that opportunity, take advantage of that opportunity.
Now, would you say that somebody that plans something over the course of a few weeks, a few months, still may have impulse control issues?
Right. I mean, that's saying that a person didn't plan or premeditate a crime. What I am saying that yes, there's probably still some impulse control issues there.
And the younger a person is when they commit the crime and become involved in the criminal justice system, does that make it more or less likely that they can be rehabilitated?
I would almost think more likely, and I base that upon the fact that the juveniles that have been released have the lowest recidivism rate of anybody. The state does well at 24%, but 1% is fantastic. So I would say that they have a better chance for rehabilitation, and also these are young offenders, their minds are still subject to change.
Does your opinion change about Ethan Crumbley's opportunity to be rehabilitated or likelihood of being rehabilitated based on the facts that the prosecutor just shared with you?
Well, I have to say, I find those facts to be horribly disturbing. They are, and there's no question. But do I still think he has the opportunity, the possibility to change? Yes.
Now, the prosecutor also asked you about bills pending to reinstate good time credits, correct?
Yes, I'm not aware of it.
Are you aware of bills that are currently pending to prevent sentencing juveniles to life without parole?
No, I'm not. I'm not familiar with that.
No further questions, Your Honor. Thank you.
Thank you. With that being said, any reason why this witness should not be excused?
No.
Thank you. With that being said, doctor, you may step down. You may also leave the courthouse. Please don't discuss your testimony with anyone. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Defense, any further witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may call your next witness.
Defense would like to call Dr. Fariha Kadir.
Thank you.
She'll just be retrieved from the hallway, Your Honor.
Mhm. Thank you. Doctor, you're going to walk towards this way. You're going to stand in the witness box and then face my clerk to be sworn, please.
Please raise your hand. Under penalty of perjury, do you swear or affirm the statements you're about to make to this court will be the whole truth? Yeah. Please have a seat.
Thank you. And doctor, if you could, please keep your voice up for me. The sound tends to fall in this courtroom, so please keep your voice up. If you could, please state your full name and spell your last name for the record.
My full name, Fariha. Last name is Qadir.
Thank you. That being said, defense, you're a witness. And again, ma'am, if you could, please keep your voice up for me.
Doctor, I know it's not an easy position to be in, but if you could just keep your voice up just so that we can make a perfect record of this, okay? Because it's being recorded.
I will try my best.
Can you give us your name one more time? You don't need to spell it, just state it.
Fariha Kadir,
All right. And where are you currently employed?
Easter Seals of Michigan.
All right. And what type of establishment is Easter Seals?
It is Oakland County through Oakland County Health Network. It is a non-profit organization.
And again, I'm sorry, ma'am, but if you could just raise your voice for me a little bit more.
It's okay to almost yell. And what type of services does Easter Seals provide?
It's mental health services in the Oakland County.
And to hold the position that you currently do working at Easter Seals, what type of education did you have?
I'm a medical doctor and trained as a psychiatrist.
And where did you go to school?
My basic medical school is from Rawalpindi Medical College, Pakistan. And my residency training is from Wayne State University School of Medicine.
And how long have you been employed at Easter Seals?
8.5 years.
Prior to Easter Seals, did you work anywhere else?
Yes, I was working in a private sector, more like privately employed.
Yes, and again, please keep your voice up. I'm sure my staff is having a hard time and my staff is indicating, yes, we are not catching your voice for the recording. And so what happens is if a transcript is made of this later on, it will say inaudible. It will not catch anything that you're saying. So it's very important that you keep your voice up for me, please.
May I go to the water to see if that helps?
Absolutely.
What is your current position or title at Easter Seals?
I'm a psychiatrist.
How many patients do you currently see?
Maybe a total of about 300.
How is it that you became involved with Ethan Crumbley?
So for Easter Seals, it's contracted to work at the Oakland County Jail, and I'm the psychiatrist who is appointed to be working at the Oakland County Jail. So that's how I see him.
All right. Do all of your patients, are all of your patients housed in the Oakland County Jail, or do you have some that are not?
No, I have some of my patients outside of jail also.
Okay. So you stated that obviously there's a contract with the Oakland County Jail through Easter Seals. How are you made aware that there is an inmate that needs your services?
So we work with the counseling department of the Sheriff's County, and they have their initial intakes, the counseling department. And based on their intakes, the mental health background, they refer patients to us.
So is that what was done here with Ethan Crumbley?
Yes.
And if you need to refer to your notes, please pull them out. Do you know the date of your first visit with Mr. Crumbley?
That was December 3rd, 21.
I'm sorry, what was that, ma'am?
December 3rd, 2021.
Thank you.
The visits that you do with Ethan, are they in person or over Zoom?
They are over Zoom.
And when you do these visits, is he in his cell or somewhere else?
In his cell.
When you initially began seeing Ethan, is it your understanding that he was on something called constant watch or suicide watch?
Yes, he was on constant watch.
And what does that mean?
Basically somebody who is at high risk to harm himself or others. So that's when they are on the watches, and constant is the highest level.
And when someone that you're seeing is on constant watch, does that mean you see that patient more frequently?
Yes, we see them every day.
So after you first made contact with Ethan, December 3rd of 21, do you know how many days it was that you saw him every single day?
I cannot remember exactly, but it was at least 2 weeks, or if not more than that. I can look at my records.
Sure, if you want to refer to your records, that would be great. Once you've had a chance to review that, just let me know.
And have these been marked in your binder?
I am not entering them as an exhibit, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Will take me a couple of minutes because I have to look at the dates.
While you look, ma'am, after the constant watch, how often did you then begin to see Mr. Crumbley?
Once a week.
So is your testimony that after the constant watch period in December, you have seen Mr. Crumbley once a week since then?
Yes. Yes.
Were you able to locate the date?
So far I'm looking at that the whole month of December. I
Okay.
was seeing him as a constant watch.
All right. Now, when you have your visits, what do they look like? Is the patient or inmate given a time, and then they're provided the tablet and you are on the other side of the Zoom, or how does that work?
So, usually at the jail, I have my patients scheduled, back to back. For him, there is a certain day fixed, but there is no time fixed. So whenever his turn comes, then I will see him.
Now, what is your role once you're assigned a patient? What is your duty?
So usually the first meeting is to, basically evaluate. The first meeting is a little bit more in detail where you are trying to find out about their past mental problems or the current ones, a little bit of family history. And once after that is done and a diagnosis is established, then you decide if they need any help, any treatment. So that's usually the first visit. And after that, the follow-ups are based on just basically management of the current mental health.
And you're saying usually, were those the steps that you took with Ethan?
Yes.
All right. So in that first visit that you stated occurred on December 3rd of 2021, how did that visit go? What do you start with?
It was a normal visit. It is mentioned in my records that he was cooperative. He gave me the history, what I was trying to find out. And at that time, I was mainly focused on how is he doing at that time, rather than going too much into the background. And he was generally cooperative. There was some background history as well, and he was generally cooperative and he provided me information.
Can you explain to us what type of background information you ask?
Since because I'm evaluating for all types of mental health issues that may have happened. So it usually starts with when was the first time you experienced any of the issues, because he mentioned depression. So so that's I asked them how long he has been feeling depressed, how long ago when it got worse. So those are the questions I asked.
Okay. Do you ask about hallucinations?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And did you ask Ethan about his hallucinations?
Yes.
And did he give you any information?
Yes. What is mentioned in my records from that time is that he talked about having two types of voices. He called them one internal and one external. External, he would refer to as a very fleeting external voice, which does come and go. It is a voice that does not interfere much in his daily life. And the other thoughts he called as my internal thoughts, which are more significant and which I cannot get rid of. And they had gotten worse about 2 weeks before the incident.
In that first meeting, are you trying to assess if someone is either suicidal or having suicidal ideations?
Yes.
And did you ask him questions about that?
Yes, I did.
And what was his response?
So he was with that first meeting, he was actually on a constant watch because he was on a suicide watch as well, because he mentioned that he was suicidal.
So based on that first meeting, the background, as well as current symptoms that he was experiencing, do you diagnose someone immediately, or do you establish like a care plan for continuing care?
So we do make a diagnosis, which we can call like a provisional diagnosis that could change over time if we are getting more information. But in his case, I did make a diagnosis of depression at that time.
Now, in all of the visits that you described, is it an inmate's choice to participate in these visits, or how does that work?
In the normal world, it is the choice. Even in the jail, it is a choice, definitely. But in his scenario, when he's on a watch, it could be, I would say they have to, but choice is always there.
So in these multiple visits that you have had now close to 2 years, does Ethan participate?
Yes, he does.
Can you describe what the signs and symptoms of major depression disorder is?
So basically, this is major depression is a mood disorder. The main two symptoms that a person should have is either a depressed mood or a loss of interest in the normal activities in life. So these are the two compulsory elements that one should have. And along with that, it can be associated with a few other things like sleep problems, appetite problems, low energy, concentration, guilt, hopelessness, and thoughts of death.
And did Ethan express a number of the things that you just described that are symptoms of major depression disorder?
Yes, he did.
Can you describe what anxiety is?
Anxiety is more of a fear of something bad happening to you, and your body reacts in a different way. It is more that you're more present as you're worried about things, you have thoughts on your mind, you are overwhelmed by those thoughts, and your body can react in a certain way, like physical symptoms. People have anxiety and panic attacks in response to that higher level of stress. Those anxiety and panic attacks are normally people describe as feeling a chest pressure, chest pain, shortness of breath, a feeling of impending doom, something bad is happening to you. So these are usually called anxiety or panic attacks, and that's a rough description.
Okay. And what you just described that encompasses the word anxiety are those things that Ethan has described throughout your meetings.
Yes.
In looking at your reports, I think in almost every visit, there's something called a PHQ-9 score. Can you explain what that is?
So this is a standardized testing we usually use as a part of our evaluations. It could be a part of every evaluation. This is a standardized testing sort of where it is scored, and we present them with a certain set of questions which are similar to what I described earlier about depression. Similar questions: are you having, how are you sleeping, or your appetite? Those are different questions, and we score it in a certain way. And then the score has mild, moderate, severe, the level of depression.
Okay. So based on the responses to those questions, there's then kind of a rubric to determine where the person falls. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And is this a test or evaluation that you have consistently performed on Mr. Crumbley?
Yes, from time to time.
Would you agree with me that when you first performed the test in February of 2022, you scored him in the moderately severe, which then after that says active treatment, psychiatrist, and therapy?
It is. I can confirm from my notes, but if this is what is written, then that's what it is.
Okay. And what does that score mean, moderately severe?
So moderately severe means that the symptoms that are discussed or described, they are present on most of the days. So how this we categorize is that those symptoms are either not present at all, or they are present sometimes every day, or almost some days, or almost every day. So this is how the severity goes up.
And isn't it true that after a few months of these weekly visits and therapy, he's now been scored at mild? And can you describe what that mild range is?
It's the same thing, that basically those symptoms have decreased in intensity and severity and the frequency.
What is Mr. Crumbley's diagnosis?
Right now, I have major depressive disorder, severe, and adjustment disorder with anxiety.
Can you describe what adjustment disorders with anxiety is? I know you described anxiety, but can you describe the adjustment disorders portion of that?
So usually we call adjustment disorder when same symptoms are in response to a certain stressor in your life. So a major depression it can be without a stressor, but adjustment disorder is usually in response to something happening in your life, like a loss in your life or any other trauma in your life. So that's what I describe it. And it has to be related to that stressor, and it usually should resolve when the stressor is gone.
And were you able to determine what that stressor was?
So if I remember correctly, the time I added this diagnosis was when he reported having more anxiety symptoms at a certain time. It was not right in the beginning. It was somewhere in the last year, late last year, I think. Most probably around the time when he had another big court hearing coming up, around that time that his anxiety was getting worse, and that's when we diagnosed.
And these diagnoses, again, are in response to the symptoms that Ethan has described and also the symptoms you've been able to observe, correct?
Yes.
Have you prescribed medication to Ethan?
Yes.
Do you know his current medications?
He is on Prozac. He is on hydroxyzine and trileptin.
Okay. Can you describe what each of those medications are responsible for?
So Prozac is the main antidepressant that he takes. So basically it is supposed to help with the depression, but it does take care of the anxiety as well. Hydroxyzine we started to use mainly initially to help with sleep. But at the same time, it has some anxiety benefits as well. So we are using it for both of those reasons. And the third medication, trileptal, it comes under the category of what we call a mood stabilizer. That was to help with some of his anger episodes that happened.
Okay. I'm sorry, you said anger episodes that happened?
Yes.
Thank you.
And let's talk a little bit about that. If there is an anger episode, are those things that he tells you about?
Yes.
Have you adjusted and added medications by what he tells you and what you observe?
Yes.
In looking at your records, I believe that Ethan had agreed to take medication in the beginning, and then there was a period of time that he didn't like how he was feeling and he stopped. Is that correct? All right. Currently, he is on those 3 medications that you described, correct?
Yes.
Do you know how long it has been since he agreed to again start taking medication?
The first time he agreed was after October of last year, when we started the Prozac.
So October of 2022, moving forward.
Yes, but that was the Prozac. The one that we tried before was prior to that, so that would be maybe 2 or 3 months before that.
Okay. So the initial medication that you gave him was something different than what he's currently on, correct?
It is the same class as Prozac, but just a different medication.
Different medication. And at the jail, I know there's multiple ways to receive medication. I know especially with mental health medications, you can get an injection or you can take a daily pill. Are the medications that you just described something that Ethan takes by mouth or something that is injected?
Oh, these are all by mouth.
And obviously an inmate can refuse to take a medication if they don't want to take it, correct? At this time, are you receiving the report that Ethan is taking his medication daily?
Yes.
The medication that you just prescribed, is this medication available in the community? If someone was having the same or similar symptoms, but not in a jail facility? Are the signs and symptoms that Ethan is suffering from manageable with appropriate treatment and medicine?
Yes.
I want to go over some of the things that you do during your sessions. You have taught coping techniques, correct?
Yes.
You have taught him breathing techniques.
That is more through his counselor, but yes, we have talked about it.
You encourage eating.
Yes,
You encourage exercise.
yes,
You encourage bathing or taking care of your physical appearance.
yes,
You encourage him to read, to occupy his time.
yes,
You provide support and education.
yes,
You provide encouragement,
yes,
and you provide insight and support, correct?
yes.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. People cross.
Yes, Sharon, thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Kadir. Dr. Kadir, you have not diagnosed the defendant as psychotic, is that correct?
No.
And
I'm
if you
sorry.
have, you would have,
That's a double negative. Could you rephrase your question?
she has not diagnosed the defendant as psychotic.
Correct. Her
The
answer was.
answer is yes.
You have, I'm sorry.
I have not diagnosed.
Thank
it.
you, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for making that clarification. Okay, and if you had, you would have noted that in your reports. Correct?
Say that again.
If you had diagnosed him, you would have put it in your report
Yes.
and you would have prescribed a medication for that, correct? Okay, and you talked about this question of hallucinations, but in fact, he told you these voices, they're not directing him to do anything evil, right?
Yes.
And he talked about having some internal voices, but when you visit with him, he's not responding to internal stimuli.
Yes.
Agree? Okay. Doctor, you have seen this defendant over 100 times, right?
I guess.
And well, we counted them, let's say 102, give or take. And each visit is about 15 minutes or in that ballpark?
About. 15.
Okay, so you would have spent about 25 hours with him over a really pretty extended period of time.
Yes.
Okay, since he got to the jail.
Yes.
And you saw him first every day or every 3 days and then once a week
Yes.
since then. Okay. And you're not aware of the underlying facts of this case? You're not aware of the underlying facts of how this defendant committed the crimes?
No.
Okay. How he killed the victims or what led up to that or his writings, any of that? Okay. And you're not certified as a forensic psychiatrist, correct?
No.
That's a different specialized area. And so your role is not to evaluate this defendant in the crime, it's to assist him with his symptoms
Yes.
at the jail.
Yes.
And to the extent you've diagnosed him with anything, it's based on your observations of him at the jail as opposed to trying to diagnose where he was prior to the commission of the crime.
So my first evaluation, because it included a little bit of the background, because as I mentioned earlier that I got, in order for me to diagnose him as major depression, I needed history prior, because I saw him on the 3rd, which is 2 or 3 days after the incident. So a little bit before.
Okay, and that was based on his self-reporting.
his son.
Right, you didn't have other evidence, you hadn't reviewed his writings or anything he did prior to the crime. You asked him, had you been experiencing this and when did it start? I have nothing for you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Defense,
well-
redirect. Sure.
I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Any reason why this witness should not be excused?
There you are.
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. With that being said, doctor, thank you for being here. You may step down. Please don't discuss your testimony with anyone. Thank you. With that being said, this is a good time to take a break. So we're going to take about a 10-minute break. Again, to those in the courtroom, please be seated until the defendant has exited the courtroom. Deputies, you may take the defendant. Thank you. Court stands in recess.
All rise.
Your Honor, calling people versus Ethan Crumbley, case number 2022-279-506 FC.
Thank you. Appearance for the record.
Karen McDonald on behalf of the people.
Thank you, Mark Keast on behalf of the people.
David Williams on behalf of the people.
Paulette Michelle Lawson on behalf of Ethan Crumbley.
Amy Happ on behalf of Ethan Crumbley.
Deborah H. McKelvey on behalf of Ethan Crumbley.
Thank you and good afternoon again. You all may be seated. With that being said, defense, prepare for your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor, may we briefly approach?
Absolutely. Thank you. After the conference at the bench, I'm gonna leave the people to address their witness that's sitting there. With that being said, defendant, you may call your next witness.
Thank you. We would like to call Dr. Daniel P. Keating.
Thank you. Thank you, doctor. You're going to approach the witness stand. You're then going to stand in the witness box. Face my clerk to be sworn, please.
Please raise your right hand. Under penalty of perjury, do you swear or affirm the statements you're about to make to this court will be the whole truth?
I do.
Thank you. Please have a seat.
Thank you and good afternoon, sir. If you could, please state your full name for the record and spell your last name.
Daniel Keating, Keating.
Thank you. And if you could, just keep your voice up for me. I would greatly appreciate it. Defense, your witness.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, doctor.
Hello.
I want to first go over your education. Can you tell the court your educational background, please?
I received a bachelor's degree from College of Holy Cross in Massachusetts and an MA and PhD from the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore.
Okay, I'm just going to briefly go through it. And did you have any specific concentration in any of those programs?
Developmental psychology is a primary one, subsequently broader developmental science.
Your Honor, I will direct your attention to exhibits K for Dr. Keating's CV and L for his report.
Thank you.
So obviously, in looking at your CV, you have had a number of important professional positions. I don't want to go over all of them, but can you briefly describe your past professional positions and then go into what you are currently doing?
Yes, I've been on the faculty at a number of universities, including University of Minnesota, University of Maryland, University of Toronto, and currently at the University of Michigan, where I'm a professor of psychology, psychiatry, and pediatrics, and a research professor in the Institute for Social Research.
Is research a large part of your job?
Yes.
And can you describe to the court what type of research you have been involved in?
Developmental science broadly, within that most recently specifically, or actually career long, on adolescent development, and more recently in adolescent brain development and adolescent neurodevelopment. I also have been involved in research looking at early childhood development and effects of early life adversity on the life course.
Have you been published a number of times?
Yes.
Books and in peer-reviewed journals?
Yes. A number of books, 9, and peer-reviewed journals. I don't remember the exact number now, 70-ish.
Have you received any honors?
My most recent book, called Born Anxious, was awarded the best book in developmental psychology in 2019. I should also mention that I was a fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research for a number of years.
Your Honor, at this time, I'm asking that Dr. Daniel Keating be qualified as an expert in adolescent brain development.
No objection on it.
Thank you. This witness will be reflected as an expert in adolescent brain development. You may continue.
Thank you. Are you familiar with the U.S. Supreme Court case of Miller versus Alabama in regard to juvenile life without parole sentences?
I am.
Was your work and research part of the science that is discussed in the actual opinion on that case?
Some of my work was cited in the amicus brief from the APA with respect to that case. Indirectly, I participated in a number of discussions for MacArthur Foundation Research Network on juvenile justice and adolescent development. Discussions in that group were reflected in a variety of ways in the brief that was put together.
Since that case, there have been a number of other cases involving life without parole sentences. Has your work and research been used in any of those most recent cases?
I and a number of other folks were signatories to an amicus brief on the Michigan Supreme Court recent decision extending through to age 18, the Miller protections.
Moving on to the report that is in Exhibit L. I did not ask you to review anything about this case, correct?
That is correct.
You have never met with Ethan Crumbley, correct?
I have not.
You are being called here in this case as an expert. How is it that you are able to give an expert opinion on this case without reviewing the material and without meeting with Mr. Crumbley?
The scope of my expertise is around the science of adolescent development and adolescent neurodevelopment and adolescent cognitive development. And so my ability to describe what the science that underlies Miller and similar cases is what I'm able to testify about as an expert.
So your testimony and report is based solely on brain science and your research, correct?
Correct. And others' research, yes.
Of course. Let's talk about your report. It's broken down into 8 sections, correct? When you talk about adolescents, what age range are we talking about?
The most recent designation that I go with is from the National Institute of Health, which for purposes of research identifies it as the period between approximately 11 years old and 24 years old.
Are you able to summarize the work that you have done in regards to examining the development of an adolescent brain?
Well, the field has identified a number of different specific hallmarks of adolescent brain development, which I can list. The first is the development of what's known as the bottom brain colloquially, or the limbic system, that encompasses an amygdala primarily and the ventral striatum in the brain. It's responsible for a variety of things having to do with incentive systems, reward systems, pursuit of things that one wants to do, exploratory activity, and so forth. The second major developing area in the adolescent brain is known as the prefrontal cortex, and ultimately the prefrontal system, colloquially often known as the top brain. And it is responsible for inhibiting impulsive behaviors, for effortful cognition, for planning, and for thinking things through in terms of a decision. The third feature to be aware of is the relationship between them. The limbic system or bottom brain shows a period of very high activation, hyperactivation, beginning in middle adolescence and carrying on until the early 20s. So the incentive and reward seeking system is at a height during that period of time. The prefrontal cortex and prefrontal system develops more slowly and more gradually. The difference between them is known as a developmental maturity mismatch. So that's the third hallmark, is that you have a hyperactivated limbic or bottom brain and a still gradually developing prefrontal cortex, which is which has to do with, as I say, the ability to inhibit impulsive behaviors and thinking things through in a more planful, logical, and cognitively effortful way. And then the fourth hallmark is that it's a period of extremely high neuroplasticity. What that means is that the brain is rewiring itself, particularly during the adolescent years, more so than at any time since the fetal period and the first year of life. So the bottom brain, the top brain, the relationship between them, and the extreme neuroplasticity are the four hallmarks of adolescent brain development.
Okay. In Michigan and under Miller, they use the age of 18, correct?
Yes. Well, I believe Michigan is now 19.
19. Is that age cutoff consistent with the scientific studies showing when an adolescent brain matures into an adult brain?
No, that is not consistent with the science.
Ethan was 15 years old at the time of this offense. That falls into your studies as being an adolescent brain, correct?
Yes.
I want to discuss the first section of your paper, which is titled Immaturity of the Prefrontal Cortex and Executive Functions. I know we touched on this just a moment ago, but can you explain to the court what is the prefrontal cortex and what is it responsible for?
So the prefrontal cortex is the most advanced of our brain areas compared to other species and earlier versions of our species. And that is responsible for what are known as executive functions, which have to do with the ability to think through things in a systematic way, to focus attention and to shift attention appropriately. So in carrying out those executive functions, it includes things like planning. In addition to that, it's a primary way that individuals learn to inhibit impulsive or impetuous behaviors.
And does an adolescent brain have any limit on its prefrontal cortex compared to an adult?
Well, it's developing gradually throughout the adolescent years until it reaches maturity, as I say, in the mid-20s. That gradual development means that it does function in the ways that I've just described, but in a less mature, less efficient way with fewer resources available, cognitive resources available to carry out those more thoughtful approaches to things.
Okay. Can you explain what hot and cold cognition is?
So the distinction is made between hot and cold cognition on the basis of how much, in a sense, is riding on what are the stakes in coming to some kind of a decision or an action or behavior. And basically the cold cognition is when there's not very much at stake, when it's you've asked to come into a lab and do a logic test or whatever, a low stakes academic test where there's not much writing on it. Under those circumstances, what we see is that by around age 16, that adolescents are not very different from adults in their ability to do things like solve logic problems and so forth, when it's a cold cognition scenario. Hot cognition is essentially when the bottom brain or the limbic system gets involved, when there's emotional arousal, when there's a variety of things that are driving the system that have to do with the hyperactivation of the incentive and reward system along with the emotional arousal system. So that is a hot cognition scenario. And in that scenario, you have a tension between the bottom and top brain, and it's much more difficult then for the prefrontal cortex to organize and control behavior.
Okay. In your report, you state that having embarked on a plan to undertake a risky behavior, the execution of that plan may use up the available prefrontal cortex resources, further compromising the adolescent's ability to adjust behavior when circumstances warrant. Can you explain that?
Sure. So the prefrontal cortex, one of its characteristics is that it is a very limited resource. We can only focus our attention on one or at most a couple things at a time in any kind of an efficient way. given that adolescents in general are already compromised with respect to their prefrontal cortical development, this then makes it further difficult. It is using resources that would be so when embarked on a problematic, impetuous, impulsive, otherwise ill-suited plan, a lot of that prefrontal resource is being used to carry out the plan, therefore further limiting the already limited availability of prefrontal resources.
You also state that until the maturation has occurred, the ability of the rational, analytic, judgment, and governance functions of that prefrontal cortex to override those decisions is limited. Is that correct?
Yes, because of that developmental maturity mismatch between top and bottom brain.
Is the ability of the prefrontal cortex to override poor decisions lessened when the person is under extreme stress, suffering loss, dealing with abandonment, and other extremely emotional situations?
When there's a history of emotional problems, child rearing problems, perhaps nurturing problems, the stress of that can in fact amplify that developmental maturity mismatch. It makes it more difficult to moderate behavior. The activation invokes a stress system which is not well controlled. It's dysregulated for individuals with that kind of a history. So it amplifies the activity of the hyperactivity of the bottom brain.
We've talked now at great length about the prefrontal cortex. What is the limbic system that you mentioned?
So the limbic system is effectively the bottom brain, and it's primary. There are a number of circuits. Primary ones are the amygdala, which is responsible for emotional arousal, and the what's known as the ventral striatum, which is the part of the brain that, in a sense, tags what's to be incentivized or avoided, to be rewarded and repeated. It is a way, in a sense, of that system getting activated. It is also activating for other kinds of behavior. It's a primary locus for a lot of the dopamine receptors, and the dopaminergic system is responsible for a lot of the emotional and hot cognition elements that go into decision making.
Does decision making for an adolescent depend on the interaction between that prefrontal cortex and the limbic system?
Yes, it's captured in that third area I mentioned of a developmental maturity mismatch, where you have a hyperactivated bottom brain limbic system and a more gradually developing top brain or prefrontal cortex.
How does the brain of an adolescent function differently compared to an adult?
Basically along those same lines, less ability to inhibit and control behavior. Among the various things that get activated or hyperactivated in the limbic system are peer relationships. They are especially salient during adolescence, which is different from how adults react to peer presence or peers on the mind, so to speak. And the prefrontal cortex, in addition to being less developed, one of the other characteristics of adolescent brain development is that it is the prefrontal cortex we really tend to describe now as a prefrontal system because it's a network of the brain, and the systems that are the prefrontal cortex begins to take a more significant role in shaping and deploying to do various kinds of things also happens during the adolescent development. We can see that because of the tracts or neurons between different parts of the brain. And when that happens and they become strong, it's known as white matter because of the nature of the physics of myelin, which is an insulation to speed up messages, compared to gray matter, which is not yet connected or not yet wired up. So that wiring of the prefrontal system to the rest of the brain is also a really very important part of the adolescent development.
Okay. I want to move on to the second portion of your report, which is titled Elevation of Socio-Emotional Arousal, Reward, and Incentive Systems. In that section, you state that development coincides with significant changes in hormonal balance associated with puberty. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so basically at the same time, these brain developments that are going on in the limbic system specifically, talking about the ventral striatum, there is also a parallel set of developments going on biologically in the rest of the body, particularly around various kinds of hormonal shifts that have to do with sexual differentiation, sexual interest and activity, and so forth. those and other things as well. That's a prominent one. And those hormonal shifts tend to again create more of a response, if you will, around things that fall into that hot cognition category.
In that same section, you talk about benefits over risks. Can you discuss that?
So when in a cold cognition scenario, you ask adolescents to evaluate what behaviors are risky, what things are risky for health reasons or whatever reasons. Their ability to identify the risks that one might experience from being in one or a variety of situations is not very different from adults. By around age 15, 16, they respond accurately to how risky various scenarios are. Their ability to do that in the fly when they're aroused about something is substantially diminished, so that the arousal of the limbic system is one that in a sense compromises the ability to evaluate risk.
Is it true, as you stated in your report, that adolescents value the potential benefits of the behavior more highly than adults would?
So it really is the ratio between benefits and risks. So if you're asking individuals to rate, what is the reason, what is the benefit from this versus what's the risk that would result from this, the weighting that adolescents give to the benefits compared to the minuses that they would give to the risks tend to be substantially weighted more towards benefits rather than looking at the risks in adolescents compared to adults.
Okay. Let's move on to the third section of your report, which is titled Developmental Maturity Mismatch in Dual Process Models. Now, when an adolescent has thoughts about committing a murder and they even research it online, they obviously know that it's wrong. Can you explain how it is that the adolescent would then still commit that crime?
One would need to know the specifics of the situation, which I don't, but in those circumstances, one would want to understand what's the context by which the context of the thought processes and decision-making processes that led to it and that go into that.
Okay. Does the fact that I can tell you that there was planning or premeditation, does it change your findings that an adolescent brain functions differently than an adult brain?
No, not at all. There's certainly lots of different kinds of planning. As I mentioned before, planning to do something can in fact absorb a variety of different kinds of prefrontal resources that might otherwise be deployed in thinking about, is this a good plan or is this not a good plan overall? So the fact of planning obviously means that it's not an impulsive split-second kind of decision to do something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not an impetuous plan that has been carried out.
Is there anything that occurs in the brain as it matures to allow for better decision-making?
Well, both of the things. The hyperactivation of the bottom brain tends to cool down and reach an asymptote or a flat line that goes out through much of adulthood. And at the same time, the prefrontal cortex is continuing to grow physically, that we can see in the structure, but also to extend its reach across a much wider part of the brain. And so both of those, the sort of the coming down from hyperactivation of the bottom brain and the continued development and growth and functioning of the prefrontal system are the two things that affect that.
Is it fair to say that when an adolescent makes one bad decision, it is more difficult for that person to divert and stop the behavior than it would be for that same adolescent when they're 25, 30, or 40 years old?
Yes, the ability to deviate from a plan that is one judges at some point might not be a good idea is much less because, as I mentioned, part of the resources going into carrying out the plan. It's the analogy that's often used is sort of at the start getting on a train that's headed in a bad direction. The second is trying to find a way to get off a runaway train. For adolescents, that finding an exit ramp, so to speak, is much harder than just.
Can you explain what happens with an adolescent after they carry out a crime or after they carry out a risky behavior that they plan to commit, or a series of really bad decisions? Are they able to then return to reasoning and judgment, or are they forever on that runaway train?
Well, no, I mean, the sort of how that will affect their future thinking, behavior, activity, and so forth is not determined at that moment. It's a process that goes on for years afterwards. So, so yes, the possibility for rehabilitation exists at that point going forward.
How is it that an adolescent can conform their behavior after a string of horrible decisions?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Absolutely. How is it that an adolescent can conform their behavior after a string of horrible decisions?
You mean reform their behavior? Or?
Correct.
Yeah. Well, basically, it's a process of often, a longer term process of rehabilitation and resilience. And there are a variety of things that we know about the nature of resilience that play into how that might go forward. So it's obviously it's not a guarantee, it's a possibility for individuals in that situation.
In Miller, the court talks about one of the factors being immaturity, impetuosity, and impulsiveness. Does what you already explained to us today help to clarify what the court was looking at when it came up with those factors?
Yes, I think rather precisely, because the developmental maturity mismatch that I described was in fact part of the brief to in the Miller case. That specific issue of the hyperactivation of limbic and the more gradual development of the prefrontal cortex was part of what the court relied on.
Okay. Let's move now to section 4, which is the rehabilitative prospects. You talk about very substantial evidence for neuroplasticity. Can you explain that to the court?
Sure. So neuroplasticity essentially means that the brain is in a situation where it is in the process of doing a variety of kinds of rewiring of different kinds of things. And that process is one that can go in a variety of different directions. Plastic meaning it can go in a variety of different directions. The source of this, the biological source of this is what's known as synaptogenesis. And synaptogenesis essentially just means giving birth to a whole bunch of brain cells, neuronal cells, which then in the brain can be used to do a variety of this rewiring that could be going on during that period of time. In addition, we also know that how it gets rewired is dependent upon the environment and experiences that the individual is exposed to during that particular period of development. So it's plastic in the sense that it can be shaped by experiences and events that occur in that during that period of time. And we see that rewiring happening when we're doing brain imaging and what I've talked about as the white matter circuits getting hooked up. And the basic rule there is cells that fire together, wire together. So the things that are happening that are going in a particular direction, the more that gets ingrained into the brain, more likely it is to carry it out. And so in a rehabilitative context or resilience context is aiming to try to get rewiring in a more pro-social direction.
In your studies and your work on Miller, I'm sure you have had an opportunity to discuss and research the phrase that they use, irreparable corruption, correct? Can you talk about that?
Sure. So that was my understanding of how in the Miller hearing, at least, the court interpreted the research was to identify three things. One is impetuosity and impulsivity as a mitigating factor. The second is differential response to peer presence, peer influence as a second mitigating factor. And then a third factor is this neuroplasticity or the capacity for rehabilitation. That is a function of this neuroplasticity that we've just been talking about. Irreparable corruption would essentially say that we can identify, in the case of an adolescent,
yes,
would identify our ability to indicate which individuals, all of whom have, committed serious violent offenses, sometimes horrific violent offenses, to what extent can we predict that would be a lifelong characteristic of that person? The answer to that question is essentially that scientifically, we cannot answer that question. We cannot make an accurate prediction for decades hence from the point of adolescence in terms of whether or not there has been sufficiently observed resilience and rehabilitation to make a different decision on sentencing.
Now let's move on to the sixth section, impact of developmental adversity, toxic stress, trauma on adolescent functioning. Many juveniles who have received or are the subject of receiving life without parole have experienced a history of trauma or significant adversity earlier in development. Is that correct?
Yes, it's common.
Can you describe what trauma is?
So we normally think about this as a dimension from serious enough to make changes to the brain at one end, and then going up from there, making very significant changes to the brain. So we don't have a dose relationship in terms of how much stress or what particular kinds of stress, but basically at the end where we can discover or have discovered significant biological changes to the brain would be things like growing up in a situation where there's lack of material necessities, homes, shelter, food, whatever. And that kind of adverse childhood experiences are observed to make changes to the brain. And then we go up from there through a variety of different levels. The most serious ends of trauma are things that have to do with direct physical abuse, sexual abuse.
How does that adversity or trauma on an adolescent, how does that then, you're saying it actually changes the development of the brain, correct?
Correct.
Now let's talk about the substantial evidence for the prospects of overcoming those obstacles through the process that you described as resilience.
Right.
Can you describe how that works?
There are a variety of different approaches to this, but the two most prominent ones that have the best empirical support, the most effective is what we know about how the impact of positive social connections is a function of resilience. Those positive social connections can occur with a variety of individuals. It could be with extended family members. It could be with other adults, in school, coaches, teachers, that sort of thing. Or it can be peer or romantic partners that create that sense of social connection. So if there's a social connection or more than one, multiple social connections with positive individuals, with positive relationships with those individuals, generally known as relational health, that will in fact substantially play a substantial role. We know that plays a substantial role in what we think of as resilience. Resilience basically means that individuals who have a lot of adversity or trauma early on can nevertheless function well as adults. And we've then tried to track how does that happen, right? How does one overcome the odds, more or less? And so social connections are a primary one. Another one with empirical support is, in a sense, getting or having a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, a sense of goals, wanting to do something positive. Some people think of it as mindfulness. Some people think of it as in a variety of other ways. But basically, it is having some kind of an anchor of a goal or purpose in life.
I want to follow up a little bit on the social connections. Could the social connections be with a doctor or a counselor?
Could be with anyone, really.
Okay. And when we talk about developing the meaning and the purpose to help with rehabilitation, that could be a job, furthering education, things like that, correct?
Yes.
What happens when an adolescent is in a constant state of fight or flight due to chronic stress?
A variety of things. With respect to brain development, one of the things is that it tends to amplify that developmental maturity mismatch. So when we think about the arousal and the incentive and reward structure that is part of the limbic system, that when things are getting into the hot cognition scenario, basically what that's doing is then activating a stress response system. So what we know from the history of research on the history of adversity and trauma, is that will react more often than is necessary. It will go to a higher sense of needing to do fight or flight or sometimes freeze, and take a much longer time to come back to a baseline level of stress response. So the connection between a limbic system and a stress response system, if that system is dysregulated, if the stress system is dysregulated, it further amplifies that activity of the limbic system.
When you're discussing the extreme stress in your report, you say that there are lifelong consequences. Effects begin to show up as early as adolescence, however, especially in physical symptomology, in sleep disruptions and other things. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so when there's been exposure to toxic stress earlier in development, in early childhood or even in the womb, for example, it can change how the stress response system would function. When the stress system is dysregulated, among the consequences that are the most meaningful is that there's an overproduction of cortisol, which is the fight or flight hormone that we just talked about. So that over responsiveness of that means that there's an awful lot more of this cortisol circulating through the system at a given time. Behaviorally, it tends to make individuals aggressive and reactive in a variety of ways to others, and in generally behaviorally not to be predictable in one's behavior that can lead to social isolation or rejection and so forth. So there's a behavioral consequence certainly as early as adolescence. We also see is that if it's not changed in any way, if that carries through to adulthood, that can continue to show up behaviorally in terms of anger and aggression and so forth. But it also has lifelong health consequences. And so we know that there's a huge burden called allostatic load that individuals who have a dysregulated stress system carry. And it can show up because cortisol is toxic to most organs in the body. If it's in the excess level, it can show up in essentially a whole wide range of diseases, cardiovascular diseases, metabolic diseases, a whole wide range of them. It can show up in a variety of different ways. So it has behavioral consequences, psychological consequences, because it's typically an unpleasant state to be in all the time, as well as then substantial health consequences, including excess morbidity and reduced longevity.
Now, I know you've mentioned the developmental maturity mismatch. Can you describe that and explain what that is?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Can you describe that and explain what that is, the developmental maturity mismatch?
Yes, it's the hyperactivation of the limbic system and the slower and more gradually developing prefrontal system.
And you described it as all acceleration, no brakes. Can you explain that?
That's basically that the accelerator, by metaphor, is the bottom brain driving one to do a whole bunch of things. The brakes is the prefrontal system, which says, wait a second, is that a good idea? Maybe we shouldn't do that.
So the last section that we'll talk about is your section on resilience. And I know we touched on this. If an adolescent commits a violent crime, does that automatically mean that they are more likely to continue criminal behavior as they mature?
So when we look at that, we make first a division between what we think of as adolescent limited offending and life course persistent offending. If we're talking about a population of individuals who are already been adjudicated as having committed an offense, particularly committed a violent offense. So we have, if we compare that group of individuals to individuals who've never had any kind of offending at all, obviously there's a higher risk factor for that group. In terms of being able to distinguish among that group of individuals, the longitudinal data, even for serious violent offenders from adolescent juveniles going forward, is that the vast majority of them will desist in that rather than persist in that criminal behavior. Depending on the study, and there have been lots of studies with a lot of big populations, both in the US and internationally, we're typically talking about an 80 to 90% rate of desistance versus a 10 to 20% rate of persistence.
Now, you touched on this earlier. Part of the resilience is because of new neural material, correct?
Correct.
Can you talk about that?
Right. So the synaptogenesis produces lots of different kinds of potential of cells that could be wired into the brain potentially, depending on whether they fire together or not, which will in part then depend on what kind of an environment or exposures or events that are occurring in that individual's life. So that plasticity of having those brain cells available means that it can be rewired with much greater potential for good rewiring in a rehabilitative framework than it will be actually in adulthood, right? So that it is in fact very plastic, but also can be shaped in ways that promote things like negative behaviors or stress response and so forth. So it's a plastic period where the events that are occurring shape it. The resilience or rehabilitative framework is that those can in fact change in a direction that is supportive of more appropriate behavior.
And again, you don't know the specific facts of this case other than what you've probably heard on the news, correct?
Correct.
Your focus here today and what you're an expert on is brain science, correct?
Yes.
Now, going back very briefly to the Miller case, the court found that a sentence of life without parole was appropriate for the extremely rare youth who are irreparably corrupt. In your expert opinion, are you able to determine if a 15-year-old with an adolescent brain is irreparably corrupt?
In my scientific opinion, it is not possible to make that prediction. We have, not myself, but researchers have attempted a lot of different ways to be able to identify, can we predict which of that group would be at risk for further violent offending of that sort or similar behavior. Despite the fact that in adults, using the tools that are available to forensic psychology, I'm not a forensic psychology, but in the literature, the ability to make that prediction for a full adult, say 35, 40, 50, whatever, is pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's actually pretty good. And we rely on that. Attempts to take those tools down to the juvenile level and say, let's use those tools to figure out which of this group of individuals who may be at risk because of what they've done, which ones are likely to persist and which ones are likely to desist. It turns out researchers have not been able to get very good prediction even over a couple of years, much less a decade or a couple of decades. So until someone can present evidence that says, yes, we can predict this with some level of accuracy that we find acceptable, we don't have a scientific basis for determining anything like irreparable corruption.
I have no further questions, Doctor. I believe Brother Counsel has some questions for you.
Thank you. Cross-examination.
Yeah, thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Keating.
Good afternoon.
So Dr. King, I think you've been very clear. You don't know this defendant. You've not interviewed the defendant. You've not reviewed the videos, the journals, any of the background of this case.
I don't know the details of the case
At all.
other than general news coverage from some time ago.
Okay. And so, first of all, you are not offering any opinion specific to whether this defendant's crimes are a result of an undeveloped brain or whether there's something else, right?
Not specific to this particular case, other than the fact of the individual's age, of course, I know, and they're within the range of what we consider to be normative brain development.
So you know roughly maybe where his brain is, but you don't know if his planning and commission of this crime is related to the problem of part of his brain not being able to put a brake on another part of his brain.
In the specific case, that would require a whole host of clinical data, and I'm not a clinical psychologist.
Well, and you need facts, right?
Excuse me?
You need facts. You said
I
that there are
need the
different.
well, I would need the context, as I wouldn't trust myself to make such a judgment. That's not my area of expertise.
You said there are different kinds of plans, right? You said one of the things is the prefrontal cortex deals with planning. It's not fully developed. Counsel said, well, just the fact that someone plans to kill someone doesn't mean it's not related to brain development. And you said, no, there are different kinds of plans, right? That was your testimony.
I'm not sure that I remember the exact words, but go ahead. I'll agree to that.
You agree with me?
I think, yes, yeah.
Okay. You talked about the effect of
Clarify what I, if I recall the line of discussion, and I'd have to hear it again to be sure, what I would say, or at least what I would say at this point, is that the making of a plan, even a detailed plan, is not necessarily not the result of impetuosity or impulsivity.
Right? You could have a plan that's impetuous or impulsive. You could. But you're not
Make a
saying
plan in an impetuous.
you could, but you're not saying that this plan. was.
I'm not saying
Okay.
about this particular plan. I don't know.
You talked about adverse childhood experiences. That's, there's a way to, interview someone and look at that and give them a score on that, right?
There are measures that do that, yes. There's
Okay.
the ACEs itself, the adverse childhood experiences scale. There are a variety of others. Ideally, we'd like to have objective independent measures rather than recall as an adult, but
Absolutely, right. So you'd want to do is have some contemporaneous or objective evidence that would help you with that scoring.
yes.
But then you could score someone on that, and depending on their score, that would give you some insight on how much impact that might have had.
How much adversity they have had?
Yes.
Yeah, within limits. The ACEs, for example, is a pretty blunt instrument. So people tend not to use it for how much adversity is related to how much of an outcome. That's not, that evidence is not available to connect how much versus, like I say, there's no dose response relationship that we can identify at this point in time.
Have you reviewed any of the other reports in this case, Dr. King's report for the defense?
I have not.
Okay. You talk about hot cognition circumstances, right?
Yes.
And you've ever heard the phrase cold-blooded killing, something done in cold blood? You talk about cold cognition.
Mhm.
Can you briefly explain to the judge the difference between the two?
Between cold cognition and cold-blooded.
No, between hot cognition and cold cognition.
Oh, basically, at the simplest level, it's that hot cognition is when the bottom brain is activated at a substantial level. A cold cognition is when it is not.
Okay, does the train example work in that realm where you're talking about hot cognition and the train is going down the tracks, and because of that hot cognition, a juvenile is less likely to stop the train?
Right.
Or get off the train. If it's not a runaway train, in fact, the train's going down the tracks and then it stops. And there's a decision-making point, and someone goes to bed or goes to school or writes in their journal or talks to their friend. Now you have a chance to reevaluate, right? We're back to,
Yes,
Yes.
thank you.
so we're back to cold cognition. Is that right?
No, I wouldn't necessarily say it takes you back to cold cognition, because as you reconsider or reimagine that plan, it can reactivate the impulsivity or impetuosity that led to that. Presumably there were reasons that may have been limbic based for wanting to carry out such a plan. The fact that there's a time interval doesn't necessarily mean the next time you come back to think about it, that it is then in a cold state. It may very well just reactivate the limbic system. If there is an incentive or reward or desire for whatever reason to do it, it doesn't necessarily go away just because of the intervention of time.
So, Doc, you talk about risky behavior, the risk reward balance, right?
Yes.
And you talk about age, risk behavior profiles, the prevalence of not just crimes, but also accidental injuries. And you've used the example of serious driving mishaps.
Mhm.
True.
Yes.
And so a young driver may want the thrill of driving fast or aggressively, or want to get someplace quickly and crash and kill themselves or someone else.
Yes.
Okay. You'd agree that's very different from a driver who's not even in the car yet and says, I want to kill somebody. I'm going to get in the car. I'm going to find him. I'm going to run him down and kill him.
Yes. Those are different situations.
And the first one fits exactly in the scenario you're talking about with hot cognition and juvenile brain. They're much more likely to wind up in that circumstance than an adult.
Yes.
And the second one has nothing to do with the juvenile brain.
No, I would not agree with that.
Okay. In evaluating the risk of harm, the assumption is that it's the harm is something to be avoided, right? In other words, you may want to drive fast, but you don't want to die. You may want to drive fast, but you don't want to get a ticket. You don't want to crash, right?
Is that a yes?
Yes.
Thank you.
But if the goal is the harm, we're talking about something different, right? This is not a risk issue, it's a goal direct issue. So if someone sets out to kill someone, there's not harm to be avoided. That's actually the goal.
They are not attempting clearly to avoid that particular harm. What is driving the behavior is something that could be avoiding harm to themselves for whatever reason, that psychological or other harm. So for the same reason that adults would make such a choice, because there's something in it for them.
Okay.
Right? That would then activate whatever that is that's in it for them, could well activate those same parts of the
So
brain.
one is like self-defense, someone being physically threatened.
Just being physically threatened, being socially threatened, having a fear of low status amongst one's peers,
Being bullied.
having something that we want, the same range of motivations, obviously, that affect adults and adolescents of why one would be motivated to do such a thing is variable.
So I want to just step outside the realm of crime or murder for a minute and see if we can agree on some behavior that's not a result of a less than fully developed brain. You aware what an Eagle Scout is?
Yeah.
Okay, and you know, an Eagle Scout is a young person. You have to complete it before you're age 18. You put in like a couple of 100 hours of work. You have to do a proposal, come up with a plan, gather the materials, and execute the plan, right?
Yes.
And so if a person does that by the age of 18, we don't say they were only able to do that because they were a juvenile, right?
No, I'm not sure I follow the question, but no, we don't say that because they're.
In other words, we wouldn't say that, we would actually say that someone doing that as a juvenile has overcome the limitations of the juvenile brain and actually accomplished something that really a lot of adults would have trouble with, right?
It is true that lots of adults would have difficulty completing that course. I would not necessarily say that if one, not that I'm an expert in it, but I have some experience, that one completes that typically with a fair bit of mentoring and support and scaffolding from adults in order to achieve it.
Right. So someone who managed to achieve that kind of goal with that kind of planning and resources and materials without adult mentoring, that's really kind of a feat, isn't it? I mean, the Eagle Scout has all that support.
So if someone were to achieve make the same achievements as an Eagle Scout without any support externally, I'm not sure how that would happen, but sure, I'll grant that if one did that, that would be a rather remarkable achievement.
You talk about impulse control and inhibiting impulsive behavior. You talk about the experience of trauma, but that's variable, isn't it? So sometimes you see
trauma.
Yeah, no, the impact of that. So you might see individuals have good impulse control at a younger age, adults who have poor impulse control.
It's not perfectly correlated with age. That's correct. The effect of trauma is to compromise both sides of that developmental maturity mismatch.
But it's a range, and you'll still see people with trauma who have good impulse control and people without it who have bad impulse control.
Sure.
You previously acknowledged in other testimony that greater rehabilitation challenges exist for someone who purposely shot another. Do you agree with that?
I can't agree with it as a general rule. It depends on the context in which it would happen. I mean, if it was, let's say, in self-defense, one might have a very different view.
Okay, let's take it out of self-defense. Have you previously testified that committing you purposely shoot another person, have you previously testified that that's a barrier to rehabilitation?
That is
a barrier to rehabilitation?
No, I don't believe I've testified to that. What I've said is that individuals who are individuals who have done that as juveniles, that they will vary in their capacity for rehabilitation, but the capacity for rehabilitation is not predictable from events at that time or the nature of the events.
So, Doctor, you have not attempted to put this defendant on a scale with other defendants you've testified about and say whether he's a good prospect for rehabilitation or a bad prospect.
I haven't, and I have no knowledge of the other cases that you're referring to. So no, I wouldn't be able to put on the scale because I don't know the details of any of them.
And you're not able to comment even on him because you don't know about him.
Correct, I don't.
So Doctor, on direct examination, you talked about, and I think you talked in your report about irreparable corruption, right?
Yes,
And no one can say that someone is irreparably corrupt.
not a juvenile, perhaps older.
And are you aware, in fact, that the standard under Miller at this point is not that the prosecution has to prove that someone is irreparably corrupt?
I'm sorry, that the legal requirement is not to prove irreparable corruption?
Yes.
I don't know the law, but I'll take your word for it.
Okay. And in fact, the touchstone of the whole evaluation is proportionality, whether the sentence is proportionate to the offender and the offense, including the Miller factors.
Including the Miller factors, yes.
All right. And you've agreed, you don't know anything about this defendant's crime, the way he killed his victims, the amount of time over which he planned them, or whether it was a product of hot cognition or cold cognition.
True, I don't know the details.
Thank you.
Redirect.
Thank you. And again, you've been qualified as an expert in adolescent brain development, correct? That is the scope of your report and that is the scope of your testimony.
Correct,
And that's the scope of your expertise, correct?
correct. I'm not a clinician.
You've been asked some questions about the train ride. And there was a question that if someone is in hot cognition, but then they go to bed, then they talk to a friend, then they do some other things. You testified that that doesn't mean that the next time they have a bad thought or start having those same thoughts again, that they're starting from cold cognition, correct?
Correct. It can reactivate the scenario that was playing in their mind and that would evoke all of those prior feelings.
So the train ride can be a long one, correct?
Sure.
I have no further questions.
Thank you. With that being said, any reason why this witness should not be excused? Thank you. With that being said, doctor, you may step down. You may also leave the courthouse. Please don't discuss your testimony with anyone. Okay, thank you. That being said, the time is approximately 4:05. I understand that the defense next witness, we will not be able to finish before 4:30. With that being said, as counsel is aware, I have my criminal call on Monday, and so I cannot pick up this case on Monday because I have other matters that the court must attend to. With that being said, I will see you all on Tuesday morning at 8:30 a.m. With that being said, is there anything else we need to address for the record?
No, Your Honor.
None, Your Honor.
Thank you. Deputies, you may take the defendant. If everyone in the courtroom could please be seated until the defendant has exited. Okay. Thank you. With that being said, I'll see everyone on Tuesday at 8:30. Court stands in recess.
All right. And we cannot leave anything because. Oh, yeah, could we lock stuff up?
Recording stopped.